Okay, welcome to the first lecture from Module 1. This module is Supply Chains, Capital Projects, and Beyond. And we will talk just about that, a combination of what are some overarching supply chain issues that are seen in traditional supply chains, and then some of the things that will be amplified in capital projects settings. Today's lecture will be mostly about the traditional supply chain issues that still that will exist in capital projects, but we'll explore those in later lectures throughout the semester as well. The material for this lecture is from that textbook that I mentioned during the opening lecture, Supply Chain Management. This is from Chapter 3, and it discusses supply chain drivers and metrics. So let's go ahead and begin. Okay. The topics that we'll talk about today are what drives supply chain performance. Can we create or have a structure for the drivers that are going to have some weight or impact on how we see a supply chain performing? And the ones that we'll talk specifically about are these 6: facilities, inventory, transportation, information, sourcing, and pricing. And then finally, any kind of obstacles that we would envision as problems to trying to achieve a strategic fit. So these drivers in supply chain performance, facilities being the first one. Facilities meaning places where we have inventory stored, assembled, fabricated, production sites and storage sites. So some of that may be even more applicable to some of these larger construction projects. Where do we best place these? Obviously, in capital project setting, we have the actual site, but do we have intermediate places where we can stage work? Inventory exists in every supply chain to some degree. So raw materials, WIP, finished goods. And what kind of policies do we have in place to manage that inventory? Transportation, moving end product, and intermediate work in process, raw materials from point to point. Combinations of modes and routes that we can use. And the fourth one being information. Information has grown by leaps and bounds over the past 20 years, and with the all-encompassing systems that are now in place in large companies, going from the origination of MRP to ERP systems that basically tie in all the different business units that exist in a firm. Sourcing. So in addition to doing all the work in-house, what options do companies have for choosing to do outsourcing? When is it best to do outsourcing? And pricing. So depending on different structures of pricing through the supply chain, we can affect different levels of demand in a traditional setting of supply chains. So the framework can be proposed like this. You start with what is your competitive strategy that you're trying to achieve. When you know what that, or you have an idea of what you want that strategy to be, that can lead towards, okay, what does my supply chain need to look like to accomplish that kind of competitive strategy? Do I need to have high responsiveness, or do I need to have high efficiency? So you can see as we go from one end of the spectrum down to the other for responsiveness and efficiency, that we need to understand where we stand in that structure. And all of the bottom components that we talked about, these drivers, have an effect on whether we are more responsive or more efficient. And so we'll go into detail about each of these these cross-functional drivers and their ability to have enforce a change in the way the supply chain works. So the way that this lecture and review is structured is we're going to go through each one of these 6 and talk about the role in the supply chain, the role in the competitive strategy, and then different components of making those kinds of decisions, and show an example, I think in most of these, of some example of what a company has done to achieve, address the supply chain for that particular component. So the facilities deal with, obviously, the where in the supply chain. Where are we going to locate end product, WIP, the first manufacturing of raw materials? Each of these are important. So, this is what I was referring to before, that we're not just talking about one location for one type of facility. We really have a network that we need to consider. This will actually be a focus of the global supply chains module in the next module. And so, how do we best locate multiple types of facilities to support whatever the business it is that we're in? The role of the competitive strategy. And again, you're going to see me come back to this idea of efficiency versus responsiveness. Efficiency will promote economies of scale. So where we can, we're going to look for those economies of scale in the supply chain. And this would lead to fewer facilities, larger facilities that can basically do more. But they may be located further away from where we really need the final products to be. And responsiveness would obviously be the opposite of view, where we take smaller facilities and locate them closer to where the demand is. And that demand can be in terms of customers in a traditional supply chain, or in terms of a construction project closer to the site. One example here is Toyota and Honda. And so they've used this concept of responsiveness priority by having facilities closer to their customers. They open manufacturing facilities in every market that they've entered, and it allows them to be more flexible in products that they offer. Some even to the point when there's a downturn in the economy, they can basically produce different types of vehicles in some of these different facilities based on what the demands of the customers are. And there are some other benefits that come from having facilities in multiple countries, of course, that help them be protected against currency inflation and trade barriers. So what are some of the components that go into making facilities decisions? So what do we have? We've got location, centralized versus decentralized, which is really what I said on that last slide, and proximity to customers, capacity, flexibility versus efficiency. So how much additional capacity do these facilities really need to handle? Do you want to do it on a project-specific basis, or do you want to try to make a one-time investment, maybe in a larger facility, that allows for multiple uses? What's the manufacturing methodology? Are we product-focused versus process-focused? Warehousing methodology. How do we store all the products in the warehouse? What type of an approach we've used? Some of these topics probably you've hit on in 854, I would imagine. trade-off, of course, responsiveness versus efficiency. All right, so the second one is inventory. And how do we see inventory's role in the supply chain? Well, it's crucial. I mean, that is what ends up stopping and starting work quite often. And why do we have inventory? It's because there's a mismatch between what demand is in the supply chain and where the supply currently exists. So, and this exists in all types of supply chains. So how do we synchronize that flow? It's a main source of supply chain costs, and it influences directly on responsiveness. It has an impact on two key things: material flow time, which is the time between from when material arrives the supply chain or some piece of the supply chain to when it exits the supply chain or some piece of the supply chain. And it has an impact on throughput. So the throughput is that you look at any particular marker in the supply chain and observe how fast product makes it through that piece or gets consumed beyond that point. So it's the rate at which downstream material consumption occurs. These two concepts of flow time and throughput work directly with inventory to create a fundamental relationship that you've all had a chance to see before, and that's Little's Law, where inventory is going to be the product of throughput and flow time. So as just a simple example, if our flow time is 10 hours currently, and the throughput that we're getting out of this supply chain piece is 60 units per hour, it implies that we'll have 600 units of inventory in the steady state. That can vary, of course, over time, but if you look at the long-run average, we would have 600 units of inventory. So the questions when you start talking about trying to improve the way the business runs is, and there's no answers in this slide, but can you reduce inventory and maintain that level of throughput? And if you can, then you're reducing the flow time. So that's where the benefit comes in, and there's a lot that's built off of this fundamental relationship. In terms of competitive strategy, if a firm wants to be responsive, of course they're going to locate inventory closer to customers and in larger amounts. And obviously vice versa for a firm that wants to be more efficient. For an example, if we've got, for example, Nordstrom has customers that are willing to pay a premiums to have the products that they want when they want them. And Nordstrom uses this to their advantage by stocking more variety and quantity than their department store counterparts. They can charge a bit more, so they still gain extra margin based on from their customer base. So it has to be right for the particular firm to do this. Some of the key components of inventory decisions deal with three main types of inventory. We have cycle inventory, safety inventory, and what's called seasonal inventory. And again, these are three topics that I believe you've had exposure to. Cycle inventory is the amount of inventory that's used or consumed to satisfy demand between two shipment points. And so that's basically determined by lot size, quantity ordered, and is one component of inventory. Beyond that, then we have safety inventory. So safety inventory is going to help buffer us against those times when demand exceeds our expectations. So when we have a forecast of how much demand we expect per week, and this again can be in terms of products, consumable products in the traditional supply chain, or even worksite materials. And you can have an estimate, average weekly demand for these. And if it was the same every week, and you knew it with certainty, you'd have no safety inventory. But we all know that not to be true. So if you look over time, how much variability did you have in that demand leads to having to provide some kind of buffer, which is safety inventory. And then what's the trade-off? What's the price of carrying the extra inventory, the space that you need to provide to have that inventory on hand, as opposed to not having it and not even being able to meet a customer's demand request or continuing your project work. And seasonal inventory. So I mentioned this idea about having a constant demand per week, and beyond that, we know that at certain times of the year, certain products are going to be in higher demand than others. So how do you deal with some of that as well? This textbook that I've referred to a couple times and using for this lecture has several chapters on this material, but that actually won't be the focus of this course. We're going to use some of that when we talk about transportation and sourcing, but assume that you have some of that background already. We'll talk more about that in the particular modules. Transportation, again, another key driver and metric in the supply chain. How do we move products between stages in the supply chain? And what's the advantage of having faster transportation as opposed to slower but more efficient transportation? These things will have direct impacts, transportation will, on inventory and facilities. And so there is some repetitiveness to the idea we're going through. So I don't want to keep saying what appears to be obvious, but the faster modes of transportation give us that greater responsiveness to meet customer demands. And of course, this trade-off comes at a cost. So where do we, or how do we find that right balance? And so there's often not going to be one final answer, and a lot of it comes back to the firm or the company, the owner, to say, what do I believe what will this change in terms of my total demand if I provide a faster mode of transportation to meet customers' needs better? So, and in terms of capital projects, if we have certain due dates, project milestones that need to be met, what's the result of not meeting certain milestones? What are the penalties incurred? So you can do this comparison against those costs and relationships and reputation with what it would cost to deliver or get materials to places faster using quicker modes of transportation. One example is this company called Blue Nile, online retailer of diamonds. And instead of having expensive storefronts everywhere, they operate online, centrally locate their inventory, pay for overnight shipments of their product to customers, but in turn give that away as free overnight delivery to the customers, so that the customers find that as an attractive offer to them. So these are the kind of things you do to look at your total cost to see which way is it going. Can you actually make the product more attractive, but yet not make it more costly to you? So modes of transportation, obviously we have a lot of different ways that things can be moved. and they all vary in cost, speed, size of shipments that you can send, and so on. Information. The information role in the supply chain is important in the way that we connect portions of the supply chain together and how they talk. If we have integrated systems that show us materials that are upstream to materials that are downstream, we can better predict and synchronize the flow. This is a common issue in large companies. Projects that I've worked on in the past. In fact, I've done several projects with Lockheed Martin where this is an ongoing struggle. There are automated systems in place, systems that, SAP. But if you have something less than full implementation, how do you really have access to the right information to tell you when you need certain parts at a site so that you don't cause a work stop without assembling or having everything arrive day one when you may not need it until day 180. So there's a lot of synchronization issues that can be solved by having better information and better IT. So there's, and as I'm sure we all know, there's a lot of information that gets accumulated when you're running a business. And how do you know which pieces you want to show and not create a situation where you're providing too much information to somebody that now doesn't want to use the system the right way because they feel like it's too much of a burden. So what information is most valuable to show to make the right decisions? There's a couple of different types of examples. Anderson Windows, again from this review and survey in the chapter, has this system called the Window of Knowledge. It basically allows customers and contractors and designers to choose among thousands of components to create their own custom window and make the order online. And when they do that, they immediately get a price quote, and the order gets immediately sent off to the factory. And they've basically eliminated a few steps in getting that work initiated. Dell has had a similar system for a long time. If any of you have gone on to online, if not to purchase, but at least to browse to see what kind of computers you could buy, they have had a really neat system that allows you to just turn on and off different components that you'd want to when you want to design your own laptop or desktop before purchasing. These are just a couple of simple examples. I emphasize simple because when I'm talking about that example with Lockheed Martin and any of the capital projects that you deal with, we're talking about larger systems that have many more complications. And this is really leading to this slide, talking about push versus pull and understanding what MRP's purpose really is, and is if you don't want to say that MRP. A lot of people say that MRP is not a good thing, and that we need to lean out the supply chain, and pull is always best. I'm a firm believer that there's a mix between these two, and when you have defined deliverables and demands that you know you're going to have at certain times, you're basically defining an MRP. As that information gets less certain, then you start to have some more issues where if you could just be able to pull product as you need it because the information is getting more uncertain, that's good too. So there is no one right solution, I believe. and it's all about accurate sequencing. In fact, this is going to lead to some discussion and time that we'll spend when we get into the simulation section of the course and look at uncertainties. So a lot of it does come back to how accurate can you forecast the work or the customer demand that's taking place. All right, so the fifth driver is sourcing. And so what are the practices that are used for purchasing goods and services in a supply chain? How often do we do this work in-house as opposed to contract with a supplier? This involves supplier selection, single versus multiple suppliers, and contract negotiation. And so, so I guess I've already kind of said a little bit about these first two bullets. And the biggest thing is we don't want to be outsourcing to disadvantage our supply chain in any way. So this example with Cisco basically shows that depending on the product, they may choose to be more efficient or more responsive. And so for low-end products, they're aiming for efficiency, and they're willing to basically outsource overseas to the lowest cost manufacturer and implement economies of scale in transportation. So, have things sent over less frequently but in bigger bulk to keep costs down on low-end products. An example here is routers for home networks. But on some of their high-end products, they use the opposite approach, where they want to be very responsive. They'll contract with local suppliers or manufacturers in the United States so that they have a closer relationship with how the work's being done and being able to get product to them more quickly and ultimately to their customers. And so the plan, I think, is Module 4, that I'd like to do some sourcing. We'll see how that goes. And in terms of, what's the final verdict on if you can do sourcing. And you basically don't want to do sourcing if it's not going to provide some kind of supply chain surplus, supply chain profit. Otherwise, do the work in-house. So this is the most basic question to ask, and more often than not, that is a driver in why companies choose to do outsourcing, because it would cost too much to either have the infrastructure to provide those additional manufacturing elements, or it would cost too much to grow the resource base to have those competencies in-house. Okay, the final one is on pricing and determining the amount to charge customers in a supply chain. And this kind of strategy can be used to better match supply with demand. It's almost basic economics. Yes, again, I'm coming back to efficiency versus responsiveness. And the concept here is that depending on how quickly a customer needs a product, you can charge a premium. And not only just on products, but it really is shown in shipment. You can see this for any online merchandiser. When they offer products, they'll offer you 4 or 5 shipment options based on how fast you need the product to be received. So this is the most common and easy to show example of differential pricing. Now, you can also talk about differential pricing on the product itself, and this can often be used to spread out demand for a product. If you have some products that are in high demand during the Christmas selling season, maybe you can offer it for a slightly lower price to encourage demand to occur off-peak. This may be a little bit more difficult in terms of a large-scale project implementation because you basically you need the products when you need them, and unless you again go for some kind of economies of scale where you pre-purchase items, then you may not have some of that same flexibility. Okay. So just in wrapping up, the issues that we may have to achieving strategic fit is there's, again, in the traditional supply chain with the increased variety of products, there's less commonality, and so you start having to set up dedicated supply chains to deal with individual products. In capital projects, I guess one of the biggest issues would be that no two projects will be alike. And so you go through the exercise of defining a supply chain for this project. How much of this can be reused so that you gain some efficiency. And I'm certainly looking for your input back to me on your take on some of that, and may even ask it as part of an assignment. Fragmentation of supply chain ownership, and so the more people that or companies that have a stakeholder role in the overall project, the bigger issues that you're obviously going to have. Globalization brings in new cost structure issues that maybe didn't exist in quite a while ago, though, now. And executing new strategies. So, in summary, this set of this presentation should basically give you an idea of what are some of the major drivers of supply chain performance and the roles of each of those drivers in achieving a strategic fit for a particular business. And especially when we talk about when you look at the business and try to understand better how well determined is product consumption at each point in the supply chain, that will help you decide how efficient or responsive you need to be, and those major obstacles to achieving strategic fit. How do these metrics apply to capital project supply chains? I've hoped that I've addressed some of that already, and that's really going to be the focus of these modules as we step through the course. And so that's really where we will finish for this lecture, and I will see you next time. Okay, thank you.